Welcome to another edition of the Litigation Psychology Podcast, brought to you by Courtroom Sciences. Dr. Steve Wood. Joining me today, my colleague, Ava Hernandez. Ava, how are you?
I'm doing well. Greetings, Dr. Wood. Glad to be
Yes.
here.
Hey, yeah, we're keeping with, we've been kind of doing this series where we've been talking with each other and learning a little bit about one another. So it's your turn today to be on
Uh-oh.
the other side of it. So I'm excited to learn more about you, about your past, about your background. And I really just want to dive right in because I know just from conversations that we've had, you have this interesting background of what led you into the field you're in now. But just kind of walk us through where'd you start and then how did you end up as a litigation consultant?
Yeah. Well, I've had kind of a meandering path through life and sort of by accident, when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and I ended up here in Chicago, which is where I'm at now. I started working for law firms. I was hired when I was 19 years old as a receptionist for a firm. And then within about 2 months, I started doing paralegal work. And I worked in litigation paralegal space for about 9, almost 10 years after that. Um, and I worked for quite a few firms in that space. I jumped around a little bit. I worked for mostly plaintiffs' firms, but I worked for some defense firms as well, doing everything under the sun. I had initially started doing a lot of pre-lit auto claims sort of things. And then by the time I finished, I was doing pretty complex med mal work. Um, but I did a lot. I did a lot of construction negligence work, personal injury across the board, lot of med mal work, in particular, a lot of birth injury work. I did just that solely for about a year. And I just worked for lawyers for a really long time and enjoyed it. I mean, I loved it. There's so much to learn. And when I first went into that space, I mean, again, I was 19. I distinctly remember Googling, what is a plaintiff? I knew nothing about this whole world. I knew nothing. And then, boy, I sure knew a lot by the time I finished. But I learned a ton. And then towards the end of my time, I decided, I thought about, first of all, being a lawyer for a long time, scheduled for the LSATs and all of that, studying for that for a while, and thought that that was the path I wanted to take. And ultimately decided I think I was being led to a little bit of a different path and went with an original interest and love of mine, which is psychology. So I ended up leaving my last role as a lit paralegal to go to grad school for clinical psychology and wanted to come back into the same space in some way. I mean, I saw so much working as a paralegal, the ways in which behavior, bias, just humanness, humanity plays a role in the law, for better or for worse. It's just intricately intertwined. And I wanted to tease that out and continue living in kind of that niche area. So once I finished my master's in clinical psych, I ended up here, which is a fantastic place to be for exactly that niche.
Yeah, in talking that you had done, you obviously do a lot of, you've run the gamut as far as what you had background in topics and in that. What have you found since you've been working in the space is really kind of the area you've gravitated towards that's been the one that you find fits kind of your interests the most?
Man, I really, I love it all. These days we do a lot of stuff in the trucking industry, and we do a lot of trucking and auto cases, and I love that world. I love that world mostly because I get to work with just regular people, right? Regular folks, and just some of the nicest, kindest people that I have met in that industry. And I love working with drivers. I just love working with regular salt of the earth people. I grew up regular salt of the earth, from nobody, from nothing, so I've always really appreciated being able to coexist with other people like that. I also have a really big love for healthcare and for med mal cases and working in the healthcare space. I find that to be such a fascinating, complex area. So many psychological factors at play there, so much. And I've also just been fascinated by systems, right? And the way that different systems interact. And I think in healthcare, also in construction, also in trucking, but particularly in healthcare, you see the ways in which all of these systems interacting with each other can create the potential for risk, right? Or for problems. And I find that at the macro level to just be extraordinarily fascinating how policies, procedures, um, leadership, how the way an institution is run can affect what actually happens person to person, and all of that intertwined. Very fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I think that goes to you like the witness training portion, right? I mean, I
Yes,
think
I do.
that's one of the areas that you really excel in, and I think that goes back to, is that related to the kind of clinical psychology of the fact that you have an opportunity to kind of talk with these individuals who are going through a traumatic experience, and work them through that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've always loved people, and I've spent my entire life trying to understand people. That's just been at the forefront of my mind ever since I was a kid. Why do people do that? Why are we this way? And how can we create change in a person? And how can we adjust? How can we go from A to B, right? And I think so often, as we talk about constantly, unfortunately, the litigation space is connected with a lot of grief, a lot of suffering, a lot of trauma. We deal with a lot of injury, we deal with a lot of death, right? There's a lot of that. So being the clinical aspect of that, being able to sit with someone and work with them through their grief, through their suffering, through their trauma, means a lot to me, right? I believe that people should be accompanied in their pain and that we don't have to be hands off on that in the litigation space. I believe that there's ways to support the human factors in all of this in addition to the legal strategy, and that actually supporting those human factors ultimately help your legal strategy, right? So that matters a lot to me, and I definitely bring in so much of my life, my experience, myself, and certainly those clinical skills that I spent years learning and honing to work with witnesses. Because yes, I love that. The witness work is definitely my favorite part of this job. I love being one-on-one with people and working with the attorneys on the strategy for that witness, but just being there for that witness, and getting them to a place where they're confident and getting them to a place where they understand what's going on. And if I can, providing a tiny bit of peace in a situation that's not really that peaceful, right?
Yeah. And I guess the question too, one might ask is, okay, you're doing this as a litigation consultant, but a lot of the stuff you're doing is kind of therapeutic driven. Why not go in and be like a therapist? Why not go in and be a counselor? Why be a litigation consultant then?
Oh man, great question. I thought about that too for a long time. I think that, as someone who has utilized therapy at many points in my life, there is so much power in that line of work, and there's so much power in working in that way as well. I also think sometimes that the that kind of help doesn't need to only be held in the therapeutic space. I think you can apply so many of those principles outside of that. Not everyone, for a variety of reasons, has the ability to show up, once or twice a week in a therapist's office or over Zoom, to work through their life in that way. Maybe what they need is short-term support to help them through a particularly difficult time. You know, Maybe what they need is just a listening ear in that moment. And I'm also a very practical person, right? I think a lot of people that know me will say, I've heard, Ava, I like you because you're realistic about things. I go,
Very,
well,
very,
I had to be,
very
so,
black and white, right? With you,
you
Abe.
know, you got to be practical about stuff. And I think, in a perfect world, maybe some of the people I work with would be getting clinical care outside of the litigation space, but we're not in a perfect world, right? So I fundamentally believe in meeting people where they are, and where they're at is this is the little bit of help I can give. So I'd like to be here, right? I don't want to leave people wanting just because they're not necessarily able to work with the commitment and the difficulty that long-term therapy means, right? That's not necessarily for everybody, as wonderful as it can be, right? It's not that simple. It's not that black and white, right?
Yeah, and when you talk about going to graduate school and stuff, What was your, I'm assuming you did a thesis. What was the thesis topic, or what has kind of been your area of research that really, that you like to focus on?
Yeah, I actually did a course concentration with a lot of papers involved there, but I concentrated on looking at things like dogmatism, authoritarianism, and the ways in which our belief systems affect the parameters through which we view the world. The way in which people reason using their beliefs, right? The ways in which our lives are filtered through how we have been enculturated to see things has been a particular area of study and interest and fascination to me my whole life. And certainly in grad school, I spent the better part of 3 years looking into that as much as I possibly can, because I think, especially in 2024, with this large scale polarization that we're seeing, especially in the United States, more and more people are so fascinated by how can someone be so sure this is true? And how can someone else be so sure the opposite is true? What is that about, right? How can we not find common ground? Why not? Why is that so hard, right? And looking at that question and trying to understand why we think, why we hold on to the beliefs, values, and attitudes that we have is something that I've put a whole lot of thought and study into.
And I'm assuming that that transfers over when you're doing jury selection, and when even when you're talking with jurors at focus groups and mock trials, is keeping that in the forefront of your mind about the way people are answering questions is ties back to that dogmatism, ties back to some of those deep-seated beliefs that they have.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Actually, I was gonna send you a text the other day because I just started reading this book called The Enigma of Reason that I think you may really like, but it's from a couple of cognitive scientists who wrote this whole book about the evolutionary capacity of our ability to reason, right? And how so many of us think that the ability to reason, think through things, and our reasons or our justifications for certain things are based on logic, right? Are based on kind of following the natural flow of, well, if this, then that, and if this, then that, and so on until you find the ultimate truth, right? Whereas it seems more likely in a lot of research, especially over the past 50 years with experimental psychology, now we really know a lot more about reasoning and reason, and it is tied a lot more towards reasoning may be more an evolutionary trait that helps us justify our own beliefs, right? And communicate and convince others of the rightness of our own beliefs,
Kind of like
right?
almost like confirmation bias in a way, I guess, huh?
Yes. Whole heart, exactly, right? So this idea that we're sort of inherently extremely logical beings, that if you just kind of let everybody figure out stuff on their own, ultimately they're going to get to the right choice, right? Well, we all know that that's not really the way that we operate. We're a lot more confusing than that. There's a lot going on in our heads. We're weird, right? So I think bringing all of that into play in jury selection and understanding people, I think, that certainly comes into play. I just did a focus group the other week, and I had spoken to the client afterwards, and the client was saying, you know, I'm trying to tell other people. People are saying, well, of course, the jury is going to see this the way we see it. That's the only logical conclusion. If you
Yeah.
follow it to the logical end, they're going to see this the way we see it. And then she was saying, I have the Zoom on, people in the business office, other people are watching this, and they're all shocked and amazed how, no, this does not follow any kind of logical conclusion. Logic may not necessarily play a big role here. It's more about people's attitudes, values, and beliefs that create the manner in which we think, oh, that seems right versus that, right? So understanding that at a very fundamental level, and again, facing reality, right? That's an awfully uncomfortable thing to have to acknowledge, but looking at that realistically will affect the way that we're gonna, which people we want, right? And the way that we're gonna present our facts in our case.
And that's a good segue into, when we talk, you and I have talked before about kind of being in the business, and that we never cease to be surprised. I mean, a lot of the stuff when we see these jurors doing things that the client's really shocked about, me and you would kind of just laugh and like, Yeah, that's what they do. But is there anything that you have still seen that still kind of surprises you, or something that once surprised you doesn't really surprise you anymore about the way jurors act, or just anything as you see it in the legal psychology space?
That's such an interesting question. And, my first reaction actually I was speaking with our colleague Lori the other day and we were having a conversation. I mean, we were talking to each other and I remember telling her, at this point in my life, I am not surprised by anything. Nothing surprises me, right? People go, I'm shocked that they would think that. And I go, really? That makes sense to me, right? And so I think that there's very little at this point, just the way I've been raised, the life I've lived, everything that I've studied. There's very little that surprises me these days. I do think I fundamentally believe that people's behavior makes sense. We make sense, right? It may not make sense to you. It may not make sense to me, right? But if we can figure out how it makes sense to them in some way, it does make sense to them, right? There isn't very, very, very low percentage of the population are actually doing things that are straight up delusional, right? Or that are not based in any kind of reality. And even arguably, some people's delusions or hallucinations are based in some kind of reality that makes sense to them, right? I think there's a lot of research that people who are schizophrenic, for example, or may have certain delusions that they're working with, that if you unpack those a little bit, they're delusional to us on the outside, but in that person's mental world, kind of makes sense, right? So I think that there's always a reason for things, right? I don't have to understand it. That logic doesn't have to flow for me. It flows for them, right? So a big part of my job is saying, okay, this seems nuts, right? But it makes sense to them. Why? Let me figure that out. Instead of just remaining in that shocked kind of, what? That doesn't make any sense. How can that be? Right? Well, clearly this makes sense to them. So let me tease out and figure out why. How are they getting there? What worldview are they placing on this topic to pull out the conclusion that they did? Right? I think that's a very interesting kind of thought process and kind of a line to go down to figure that out.
And that's one thing we always have to be cognizant of. I mean, how many times have we been in a focus group where someone says something and somebody in the back row goes, "What?"
Exactly.
And then
And
we
then
have
they
to keep
start
a straight
driving.
face because it's kind of like nonsensical. But I think to your point is true as we talk to so many people across so many different venues who come from all these different walks of life, is you have to have an understanding that while you may think it's crazy, I mean, there's been plenty of times I've heard jurors say things that I think are completely ridiculous, but
Right.
they're important to them. So then I listen to it because if it's important to them, then it's probably important to the case and important to the client. So I think that's
Right.
one of the things too, probably that helps you when you're doing your job, is that kind of empathy, that kind of being able to see other people's point of view, of taking that, and rather than dismissing it, you're able to then give actionable recommendations to the client because you said, hey, whether this is crazy or not, this is what resonates, this is the type of things that's going to be persuasive to them, right?
Mm. Yeah, and I think, you bring up a good point that we have a very natural human tendency to dismiss other people's conclusions if they don't make sense to us, right? We think, oh, that's illogical. All right, well, that's just like a fringe. That's just nuts. I don't have to worry about it too much, right? We don't want to acknowledge or deal with or enter into other people's what we may perceive as their delusional world, right? But especially if you're an attorney, trying to figure out how to shape the way that you're going to present your case to people, that stuff does matter, right? As uncomfortable as it may make us to have to acknowledge everyone's kind of illogical ideas about things, right? It That's how it is, right? Again, the realism, the practicality of it, right? I had a focus group again recently where jurors were really stuck on the fact that this particular accident had happened during COVID, right? And they had all these things about how mask policies or certain other things would have affected this whole incident and how COVID played a role here. And the attorneys were getting a little bit, frustrated. Like, it had nothing to do with COVID. I can't believe COVID's even coming up. Why are you thinking about COVID? That's nothing. Leave it to the side, right? We're uncomfortable with that because they were right. This had nothing to do with COVID in reality, right? But people perceive it in some way as being enmeshed. So it does matter to them, right? So we have to figure out a way to acknowledge that instead of dismiss or diminish other people's ideas about things. And I think that's a really tough thing to do, especially when you've been working up a case for a few years. You intimately know the facts, you know exactly what's going on, right? And when people pull out kind of odd perceptions of things, you think, wait, stop, that has nothing to do with anything, right? But it does to them. And I think that we do the case and our clients a disservice when we diminish the way that other people are legitimately thinking about things, even if it doesn't make any sense, right?
And I think it's always interesting that when we go into these, a lot of times, the clients are going in with the best intentions, right? They want to get information, they want to be able to figure out what's going on with their case, but then until they actually hear it, or they hear something, and how much
Yeah,
jurors don't like the case, it's kind of
yeah,
like, oh, but
yep,
but I
yep,
mean, kudos to them to do it. But yeah, it's always tough
right,
to
right.
have to listen to the negativity after you've been working on it so long.
Yeah,
But I think it helps obviously to push it forward, whether we agree or disagree. It's
yeah.
for the best for the case and the client.
Right. I've been telling everybody that in my focus groups now. I kind of say, listen, I know a lot of this information is going to be terrifying, right? We might not agree with a lot of this information. Listen, better to know now, right? What I want to do is create a space where people are comfortable enough to tell me what's on their mind, even if they think that I don't want to hear it, even if they think that it's going to screw up the way that I'm viewing the case. I need them to let me know legitimately what they're thinking, right? Not censor themselves to give me what they want, right? Now I'm not getting good data. Now I'm just getting what they think I want to hear. I want to know what they are actually thinking, for better or for worse, as terrifying as it may be, right?
And we talked about kind of getting the perception of the other side. You had mentioned that you had done some plaintiff attorney work, and I know a lot of the stuff that we do is more defense oriented, but you've worked for some plaintiff attorneys. How have you used that training, that kind of that view that plaintiff attorneys bring to the case as it relates to more from the defense perspective? Because I think you bring a different perspective. When you and I have talked, you do a very good job of being able to see the plaintiff attorney's side or the plaintiff's side. And I think it goes back to just your training and then also probably your experiences with plaintiff firms.
Well, I appreciate that. I remember the last focus group we did, I said something and you were like, how very pro plaintiff of
Yeah,
you.
exactly. What
Yeah,
side are you on right
yeah.
now?
But no, I mean, I honestly, I think, and I had the privilege of working for some incredible plaintiffs attorneys who were at the top of their field and just, I mean, really killing it in what they were doing, and learned an incredible amount, right, about the ways in which, because it's a very different mindset of how you're going to approach the case, I think. And I think plaintiffs attorneys are very good at tapping into some of the humanity and some of the psychology sometimes, right? Which is easier for them on many levels, right? Because the plaintiff attorney is representing an individual, right? A family or an individual, a person, a human being. And it's a lot easier to bring in some very human themes when you're talking about an individual versus when you have the tough job of defending a nameless, faceless corporation, right? That's a lot harder to bring into some of these human themes. You're going to be able to convince a jury a lot more about the pain and suffering of this person that they can see and touch versus trying to convince a jury that, if you award this amount of damages, this is how you're going to screw over a nameless, faceless corporation, right? It's a very different mindset. And especially in 2024, where I think we have really are steadily climbing and continue. I don't know where the pinnacle will end, but we are climbing more and more towards people losing faith in institutions, people losing faith in corporations, people losing faith that kind of groups of people together know what's best, right? There's an individualism, especially in the States and especially recently, that's been very prominent. So it's tough, right? That's a very tough thing to do. But I do think that, I've learned so much from plaintiffs' attorneys as far as how they view their client, right? And how they think a jury will view their client and what to ask and how to set it up so that people will see their client as a victim, right? as the person who was wronged. And I think there's a certain way of approaching it where they do a good job from the very beginning to set their client up as a victim and everyone else as the perpetrator, right? So that's just a mentality that goes into the way that they ask questions, right? I see that a lot in my wets, in my witness trainings when I'm working with witnesses, a discomfort, and I understand and I feel it, the discomfort of asking these hard, cruel, mean questions that often get asked, right? Because if you're trying to set up your client as the victim, you have to set up the opposing, the adversarial side as the perpetrator, right? It has to be a little bit black and white in the law, right? You can't have this nice gray middle ground. Arguably, maybe our system would work better if we did, right? But the system that we've got doesn't do that. We've set ourselves up for some black and white thinking. We've set ourselves up for a pretty rigid adversarial system. So there's really no space to see the ways in which a plaintiff may be both a victim and a perpetrator, and a defendant may be both a victim and a perpetrator. We have to choose, right?
I think that's a good point too. Is there's a lot of conversation about humanizing the corporate defendant, and I guess the question is too is how do you see that as far as what's a good approach to humanizing the corporate defendant? As we know, there's a lot of people out there that have their kind of thoughts about how to do it, but in your
Yeah.
opinion, based upon your experience, what do you see as a better way to kind of address that?
I think that jurors, people, right? When we say jurors, we're just talking about people. I think that people do not, especially in 2024, right? People are remarkably savvy when they are being pandered to, right? When they are being asked to see something different than what they see, right? I think what we need to do on the defense side and the corporation side is more acknowledge what they're seeing, right? If jurors are coming into this and seeing a corporate defendant as, they are nameless, they are faceless, they are just profit seeking, they do not care about the little guy, et cetera, et cetera. I think we have to acknowledge those assumptions, right? Acknowledge that people reaching those conclusions and assuming all of that stuff is based on a lot of factors that may be very true and real for them, right? There's plenty of examples of corporations going off the rails, right? There's also plenty of examples of individuals going off the rails. Nobody's perfect, right? But many people are coming in this day and age with an automatic concern towards the big guy, right? So I think you have to acknowledge where that comes from, right? Why that may make a lot of sense actually for a lot of people, and then start to explain why here's how that's not us. And you better be able to give some tangible, real world, true, transparent examples of how that's not you, right?
What about the philanthropy? Do you want to, should you be talking about all the philanthropic things that they do?
Yeah, I think it depends, right? I think that it depends on the corporation. It depends on, the size of your corporation. It depends on if your corporation is known and acknowledged in your community, right? I think if you walk right out of the gate, cast aside and choose to not even see people's careful assumptions about you and just head right towards, we're awesome because we give other people money, you're probably screwing yourself over, right? Because you're choosing to ignore the way that people are looking at you, right? I think you have to acknowledge the way that people might see you and acknowledge why that might be and why that's based in a reality that makes sense to a lot of people. I think it's when corporations try to diminish other people's attitudes and say, you shouldn't think that way, right? We're awesome. Don't think that way, right? We all know how well it works, when you tell someone, don't think that, right? Doesn't work too well. The second someone feels diminished, right? Or the second someone feels that you're walking over my opinion, you don't care about what I think, you just want me to think what you think is right, right? We run into a problem, right? Now we've really positioned ourselves as the nameless, faceless corporation who doesn't care about what people think, because that's kind of what you're doing by not acknowledging the way that people might see you,
Yeah,
right?
and I would look at it as, being kind of on brand as far as you don't want to be on brand, or as some of the other plaintiff attorneys would call it, being on code. You'd rather be off code because the code for large corporations is, like you said, nameless, faceless, cold, indifferent. But if you
Right.
have your corporate representative, you have your witnesses, you have your attorney, you have a lot of those individuals who are involved with the case being off brand or off code, then they realize, oh, okay, this is not what I expected from a large corporation. I have these preconceived notions. These people don't fit within that preconceived notion. And I think that's the better way to try to
Yeah.
humanize it, is to do that versus, as you said, try to force feed them information and say, like us, like us, like us. Don't
Right.
think we're cold and indifferent.
I swear, right? We're different. And I think that's a great point, Steve, that I think you can humanize yourself through your people, right? But you better be sure that your actions match your words in that case, right? You better be sure that your people are saying things that are actually matching what the company is doing, because that discrepancy and that differential, oh, jurors are looking for that, right? I don't care what you say. What are you doing, right? So you can have some incredible witnesses that help to, humanize the corporation, that help to explain that a corporation is just a group of people, right? We're all just people, and you can do a really good job of that. But even if you have the best witness in the world who comes across excellently, right? But the things the company is doing don't match how that witness is presenting, you're still going to have a problem. You need consistency there, or jurors will see that difference and dislike it a lot, right?
Exactly. And I think we'll get ready to wrap this up, but I think, I like learning more about, how you operate and kind of the perceptions that you have. Kind of how would you synthesize, when someone is getting Ava Hernandez on a case, on a witness training, kind of sum up what's Ava, who is Ava, and kind of synthesize your bio of sorts about what they're getting when they get you.
Oh man, what a question. How long you got, Steve?
We're
You
keeping
know,
this short, as you know,
yeah.
so be like
Um,
with your witnesses, short and concise.
yeah. I think that people have asked me, Ava, it feels like you have very good, instincts for this. How did grad school and going to school for psychology really help you in this space, right? And I think grad school and learning, deeper into the theory and practice of human behavior plays a big part into it. But I think more than that, you're getting someone who's had a heck of a life, right? And I think that I bring my life into this, my real world, real experience of being with attorneys for almost a decade, of being one-on-one with witnesses, of sitting through trial with our client for 4 weeks at a time. I understand intimately what that's like, the pressures that the attorneys, the clients, the witnesses, the parties to the case are under, right? And I think I have been blessed and cursed in my life to have lived in many different realities, in many different cultures, and in many different modes and ways of thinking. I'm intimately familiar with what it takes and what it means to change one's mind, to adjust one's thinking, to go from A to B, which is something, as you know, that many people far smarter than I have studied for many, many years, and we're still trying to figure out, right? And I think that for me, that lived experience of having moved from A to B and from B to C and from C to D in very radical ways in my life has shaped the way in which I understand people perceive and people adjust and change, right? Because much of what we do is the business of change, right? So I think in that sense, I put myself and my life into it, and that has gone a long way as far as my instincts and my understanding of the way in which people might perceive certain things and what might get them to change their mind and why, right?
Excellent. Ava, I'm gonna cut you loose, but I know we'll be back on because you and I are gonna do some more podcasts together where we'll be,
Absolutely.
talking about other topics. We're gonna be talking with additional guests. You and I have some papers we're starting to write too, so some Law 360 papers. Be on the lookout for me and Ava. We're gonna give Bill a little bit of rest on some of these papers, and we're gonna take over. But if anybody wants to get a hold of you, how do they reach out to you? What's your email at Courtroom Sciences?
I would love to talk to anybody about any of these things. I can nerd out on these topics all day. But I connect with me on LinkedIn, Ava Hernandez, or feel free to email me at ahernandez@courtroomsciences.com. And I'm always happy to speak with people.
Great. Thanks, Ava. And as always, head to courtroomsciences.com. All of our blogs, podcasts, all those are up there. Like I said, papers that both Ava and I have written together. Ava has some of her own stuff up there too. So I encourage you to check that out. Feel free to always reach out to me as well, swood@courtroomsciences.com. I'm always happy to talk. This has been another edition of the Litigation Psychology Podcast brought to you by Courtroom Sciences.